"Do you want to sell me this painting?" Annie asked, stepping forward just as the antique dealer shouted at the older stranger to get off the sidewalk. The man held the damaged painting against his chest, but he did not look confused or helpless. He watched Annie with the calm attention of someone trying to understand why she had stopped her car. "How much would you pay for it?" he asked. Clyde Mercer, the antique dealer who had been shouting at him, turned toward her. "This has nothing to do with you." Annie closed her car door. "I asked him, not you." Deputy Howard Briggs shifted his weight, one hand resting near his belt. "A smart girl would get back in her car," Clyde said loudly, pointing at the older man. "This confused old fool is blocking traffic and trying to cheat people with a pile of garbage. He's standing beside the produce stand," Annie said. "He isn't blocking traffic." Deputy Briggs looked at her paint-stained jeans, faded t-shirt, and worn sneakers, then glanced at the aging Chevrolet Cavalier parked behind her. "I told you to leave." "Yes, sir. I heard you." Even so, she did not move. Clyde let out a quiet laugh. "I already offered him $5, he said. "That's more than this thing is worth. The frame is warped, the canvas is torn, and nobody wants a gloomy painting of a colored woman waiting beside a railroad track." The stranger's hand tightened around the frame. "I said no." His voice was low and steady. Clyde leaned closer. "Then take your trash somewhere else." Annie turned toward him. "I'm offering more than you did. Once he sells it to me, neither of you has any reason to keep bothering him." She looked at the painting. Smoke and road dust had darkened its surface. Yellowed varnish had turned the painted sky the color of old cooking oil. A tear ran through the lower corner, and water stains marked the bottom edge. Annie studied the painting for several seconds before looking up at the old man. "This painting isn't ugly," she said quietly. "Look at her. She's standing at the train platform with her suitcase, but part of her is still turned toward that house. And the little girl watching from the window, she must be someone the woman is afraid to leave behind." Mercer gave a dismissive laugh. "It's a gloomy picture of a woman waiting for a train." "No," Annie said. "It's about someone being forced to choose between leaving and staying. That's why the storm is coming. She isn't just waiting for a train. She's deciding whether she can walk away from the life she knows." The old man's expression changed. Annie looked back at the painting. "It may be damaged, but it isn't worthless. It means something." "You're throwing money into the trash," Clyde said. Annie carefully took the painting into her arms. "No, I'm giving a man back the dignity you tried to take from him." She looked directly at Clyde. "And every work of art means something to the person who created it. You don't get to call it garbage just because you can't see its value." Then she turned back to the stranger. "Sir, will you sell it to me?" His gray eyes remained on her. "You can see something inside this painting?" he asked. "Everyone else has mocked it. What do you think it is worth?" Annie almost smiled. "I don't know." "Then why do you want it?" "Because every artist deserves respect. They had no right to insult the person who painted it, or the woman inside it." Annie opened her wallet. There were $23 inside. $20 had been set aside for gas and food until Tuesday. The remaining $3 were supposed to go toward the interest payment due Monday, though $3 would make little difference against the amount she owed. She removed the $20 bill. "I can give you this." Clyde stared at her. $20 for that?" Annie ignored him. The stranger looked at the money but did not reach for it. "Do you truly believe this painting has value?" "I believe nobody deserves to be laughed at while they're trying to let go of something." Something changed in his eyes. It was not exactly gratitude. It looked more like recognition, as though Annie had answered a question he had carried for a long time. He accepted the bill carefully. Clyde spat onto the gravel, muttered a curse under his breath, and turned away. His boots struck the ground hard as he crossed the pull-off, climbed into his truck, and slammed the door behind him. Annie released a breath she had not realized she was holding, then turned back to the older man. His clothes were plain, yet there was something unusual about the way he carried himself. He stood straight without appearing rigid, and his calm did not resemble weakness. "I'm Elias Vale." He shifted the painting beneath one arm and offered her a roughened hand. Annie shook it. His grip was firm but restrained. "What is your name?" he asked. "I'm Annie. Annie Brooks." "Annie Brooks," Elias repeated. He said it slowly, as though committing each syllable to memory. Deputy Briggs muttered something about everyone wasting his time, then walked back toward his cruiser. Annie accepted the painting from Elias. It was heavier than she expected. The woman behind the produce counter had watched the entire exchange without speaking. She poured sweet tea into a paper cup and handed it to Annie. "No charge, honey." "Thank you, ma'am." An older couple sat inside a pickup nearby. The woman gave Annie a small nod before her husband backed onto the highway. Neither of them had spoken while Elias was being humiliated. Elias watched Annie hold the damaged painting against her chest. The nearly empty wallet remained open in her hand, revealing that she had helped him with money she could not afford to lose. The older man remained silent for a moment, studying the nearly empty wallet still open in Annie's hand. "You just used the last of your money to buy a torn painting," he said at last, his voice low and resonant. "Why?" Annie gave him a small smile and accepted the canvas carefully. "Because I can't stand watching people with a little money or authority humiliate someone else. I didn't buy it because I thought it was valuable, sir. I bought it because I wanted them to leave you alone." "You don't regret the money?" Elias asked. Something deeper passed through his gray eyes. "You need it to survive in an expensive world." "I don't regret it," Annie admitted as she carried the painting toward her Chevrolet Cavalier. "I used to dream about becoming an art teacher, so watching someone treat a painting like garbage bothered me too. But you're all right. That matters more. If Annie's kindness touched your heart, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about courage, dignity, and compassion. She opened the rear door and lowered the canvas onto the seat with both hands. "At least this old car has enough gas to get me to the frame shop tomorrow," she added. She nodded toward the painted woman beneath the stained varnish. "And tonight I have a new friend to talk to. That seems like a fair return on $20, doesn't it, Mr. Elias?" Elias watched the young woman fasten the seatbelt around the damaged frame. Annie spoke about her circumstances without asking for pity. There was no performance in her honesty. No attempt to make him feel indebted. "You are an unusual young woman, Annie Brooks," he said. His voice tightened for a moment before becoming steady again. "And you have the eyes of a true appraiser. The only blind man here was the antique dealer." "I hope you're right," Annie laughed softly. Elias shifted his attention to the painting in Annie's arms. For a moment, he seemed about to say something more, but Deputy Briggs slammed the cruiser door behind him, and the sound broke the silence. "Clean the surface if you must," Elias said, "but do not erase what lies underneath." Annie frowned. "What does that mean?" "You'll understand before I have the chance to explain." Elias stepped away from the car and adjusted the worn shoulder of his coat. "Do you need a ride into town?" Annie asked. She glanced toward the darkening clouds over Catoctin Mountain. "It looks like rain." "No, you go ahead. Someone is meeting me just beyond the bend." He pointed toward the paved road ahead. Annie hesitated. The roadside stand was closing, and Deputy Briggs had already pulled onto the highway. She did not like leaving a man alone when rain was coming. But Elias showed no concern. "You're sure?" "I am." "All right, take care of yourself." "And you, Miss Brooks." Before she could question him again, a black Lincoln turned into the gravel pull-off. It moved past the produce stand and stopped beside Elias. A broad-shouldered driver stepped out, walked around the car, and opened the rear door. Deputy Briggs paused with one hand on the steering wheel. Clyde, already inside his truck, lowered the window and stared. Elias looked back at Annie once. His expression had become guarded again, but the respect she had seen remained in his eyes. "Take care of it, Miss Brooks." He entered the Lincoln. The driver closed the door, and the sedan merged onto Route 15, heading south toward Frederick. Annie stood beside her Cavalier with the painting pressed against her chest. It barely fit across the back seat. She wrapped it in the moving blanket from her trunk and secured it with the seatbelt. Only then did she look inside her wallet. $3. The fuel gauge sat just above a quarter tank. It might carry her to the framing shop and back if she avoided unnecessary trips. The debt company expected money Monday, and the 2 apples in the paper sack were now her dinner. As she pulled onto the highway, regret settled beside her as heavily as the painting. The painting rested behind her like a quiet passenger. At a red light, Annie looked at it through the rearview mirror. Even beneath the dirt and yellow varnish, the woman seemed to be staring beyond the railroad tracks toward something she could not yet reach. "I hope you were worth $20, Annie murmured. The woman in the painting offered no answer. Far behind her, beyond the bend Annie could no longer see, the black Lincoln had stopped on a private access road. The driver, Arthur Hale, stepped out in a dark suit and hurried around the vehicle to open the rear door. His movements carried the practiced respect of a man who had served Elias Vale for more than a decade. "Mr. Vale," Arthur said, concern entering his voice. "We located the disputed Bell canvas in the old Foundation warehouse, exactly where you said it would be, but the archivist reported that you removed it yourself this morning." Elias remained seated for a moment. Arthur glanced at his empty hands. "Where is the painting?" Elias raised the $20 bill Annie had given him. He smoothed it once with his thumb, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the fine leather wallet, hidden beneath his worn coat. "I sold it." Arthur stared at him. "You sold it? For $20. To whom?" "A young woman named Annie Brooks." Arthur waited, certain there had to be more. Elias looked toward the highway where Annie's cavalier had disappeared. "She had no idea what it might be," he said. "That is why she was the right person to take it. Sir, if the records are accurate, that painting may be one of the missing Evelyn Bell works. Once the attribution is restored, its value could be substantial." Elias's expression hardened at the word value. "That is precisely the problem, Arthur. Too many people have spent too many years deciding what it was worth before asking whose hands created it." Arthur lowered his voice. "Should I recover it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Then what would you like me to do?" "Find out who Annie Brooks is, quietly. No contact, no pressure, and no one frightens her." Arthur nodded. Elias looked once more at the folded bill inside his wallet. She spent money she needed because she believed a stranger's dignity mattered more than her comfort. The Vale Heritage Foundation has funded people with credentials, influence, and carefully prepared speeches. Perhaps it is time we paid attention to someone with courage. Arthur closed the door. As the Lincoln moved back toward Frederick, Elias leaned into the leather seat and looked through the window at the gathering rain. Somewhere ahead, an 18-year-old girl was carrying a damaged painting into a life already burdened by debt. She believed she had bought a forgotten canvas. Elias knew she had taken possession of a truth powerful men had spent decades trying to bury. At 5:30 the next morning, Annie was pushing a vacuum cleaner through the offices of a small accounting firm on West Patrick Street. The building was silent except for the machine and the soft rattle of rain against the windows. She emptied trash cans, wiped fingerprints from glass doors, and cleaned around framed certificates belonging to people whose names appeared in gold lettering. By 7, she had changed into a clean t-shirt in the employee restroom and driven north toward Thurmont. The damaged painting remained wrapped in the back seat. She had considered leaving it in her room, but the headlights outside her window the night before had unsettled her. Pike's frames and glass had stronger locks, better lighting, and Samuel Pike, who trusted almost no one and kept a baseball bat beneath the front counter. The shop occupied a low brick building beside an old hardware store. A wooden sign above the door had faded unevenly, leaving the word glass brighter than the rest. Inside, molding samples covered the walls from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of sawdust, paper, varnish, and the black coffee Samuel brewed strong enough to remove paint. He was standing behind the work table when Annie entered, wearing a denim apron over a plaid shirt. "Morning, Miss Brooks." "Morning, Mr. Pike. I've told you to call me Samuel, and I've told you I'll try. You've been trying for 6 months." Annie carried the painting toward the back room. Samuel lowered his coffee. "That the roadside treasure? Treasure might be generous. So was $20. She stopped. "How did you know what I paid?" "You told me on the phone last night." Annie had forgotten making the call. She had been tired, hungry, and still unsettled by Elias's warning. Samuel followed her into the workroom. "Let me see it before you touch anything." Together they removed the blanket. He examined the warped frame, the torn canvas, and the darkened varnish without speaking. "Well?" Annie asked. "The frame is worth less than the nails holding it together." "I meant the painting. I know what you meant." He leaned closer but kept his hands behind his back. "The brushwork isn't careless. Whoever painted that coat understood weight. Look at the shoulder. 2 strokes, maybe 3, and you know how the fabric hangs." Annie nodded. "That's what I saw." Samuel glanced at her. "You also saw a man being pushed around?" "That too." Before he could answer, tires rolled over the gravel outside. A black Lincoln stopped in front of the shop. Samuel looked through the window. "Friends of yours?" "I don't have friends with drivers." Elias Vale stepped from the rear seat. In daylight, the worn coat was gone. He wore a dark suit beneath a plain overcoat, and although nothing about his clothes was flashy, everything fit too well to be ordinary. Samuel placed his mug on the counter. "You stay where I can see you," he told Annie. "I'm 18, and I'm 63. Neither fact makes unexpected rich men less suspicious." Elias entered when Annie unlocked the door. "Good morning, Miss Brooks." "Mr. Vale." Samuel noticed the name but gave no sign of recognizing it. "Samuel Pike," he said. Elias offered his hand. "Elias Vale." Samuel shook at once. What can we do for you? I came to speak with Miss Brooks, if she's willing. You can speak here. Elias looked at Annie rather than objecting. She gave a small nod. He removed an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the counter. What's that? Annie asked. Repayment. For $20? For your kindness, your time, and the inconvenience I caused. Annie opened the envelope far enough to see several stacks of $100 bills. Her breath caught before she could hide it. The amount could pay months of collection demands. It could repair the Cavalier, cover rent, and perhaps restore the college deposit she had missed. For a few seconds, she saw the life the money could reopen. Then she closed the envelope and pushed it back. No, Elias studied her. You should count it before deciding. I don't need to. You clearly need money. Samuel's expression hardened, but Annie lifted one hand before he could speak. Yes, I do, she said. That doesn't mean every part of me is for sale. I'm not trying to purchase you. Maybe not. But if I take this, then yesterday changes. It becomes an investment you made because I passed some kind of test. Elias remained still. Annie continued, keeping her voice level. I helped because two men were humiliating you. I didn't know your last name, what car was coming for you, or how much money you had. That was the point. The money would make your life easier. It would. That's why saying no is difficult. Samuel looked at her, then toward the envelope. He said nothing. Elias rested his fingertips against the counter. Most people would accept it. Most people might be smarter than I am. A faint expression touched his face, but it did not become a smile. Why keep the painting, then? Because I paid for it. You don't believe it may be valuable? I believe someone worked hard on it. That's enough for now. Elias returned the envelope to his coat. He did not argue or lower the offer. His acceptance of her refusal surprised Annie more than the money had. Have you begun cleaning it? He asked. No. I documented the damage and examined the surface. Good. Why? Elias walked to the work table. He stopped a respectful distance from the canvas. That painting has survived people who wanted it changed, he said. Be more careful with it than I was. Annie folded her arms. You said something similar yesterday. What happened to it? His eyes moved to the painted woman near the railway tracks. I failed to ask the right questions when I had the opportunity. That isn't an answer. No, it's the only one I'm prepared to give today. Samuel stepped closer. You drove from Baltimore to warn her about a painting you sold for $20? Elias looked at him. I drove here because $20 was the smallest part of what changed hands. The shop fell quiet. Annie wanted to press him, but something in his face told her he would not be moved. It was not arrogance. It looked more like a man guarding a confession he had not yet earned the right to make. Elias turned toward the door. Miss Brooks, document everything you do. Photograph every mark before you touch it. And do not trust the visible name simply because someone painted it where a signature belongs. He left before Annie could answer. The Lincoln pulled away, leaving shallow tracks in the damp gravel. Samuel watched until it disappeared. That man knows exactly what you bought. I know, and he's afraid of it. Annie returned to the workroom. She adjusted the lamp and directed it across the lower corner of the canvas. The pale signature caught the light. Beneath it ran the faint ridge she had noticed in her room, thin but deliberate, like letters buried under another layer of paint. Samuel leaned over her shoulder. What do you see? Annie shifted the lamp once more. Someone wanted us to read one name, she said, without noticing another one underneath. Annie did not touch the signature that morning. She spent the next hour photographing the lower corner from several angles, first under the overhead light, then beneath a small adjustable lamp Samuel used for inspecting damaged frames. Each time she moved the light, the same thin ridge appeared beneath the pale letters. Samuel brought his coffee into the back room and stood beside her without leaning over the canvas. You're certain that isn't cracked varnish? No, that's why I'm not calling it anything yet. Good answer. Annie wrote the time and lighting conditions in her spiral notebook. She added a rough sketch showing the location of the ridge, then photographed the back of the canvas again. The stretcher bars had darkened with age, and 4 empty nail holes suggested the painting had once been mounted in a different frame. She examined the remaining paper label near the upper edge. Most of it had been scraped away, but a few printed marks remained beneath the glue and dirt. One looked like part of a capital B, another might have been a date. Samuel handed her a magnifying glass. Don't convince yourself you see something because you want it to be there. I know. No, you know the sentence. Learning the habit takes longer. Annie smiled. You always this encouraging? Only before lunch. The bell above the front door rang before she could answer. "Good morning, Mr. Pike," a woman called from the showroom. "I hope I'm not early." Samuel checked the clock. "You're exactly on time, Mrs. Carter. That is what being on time means." Annie recognized the voice. Miss Ruth Carter had taught art history at Frederick High School for more than 30 years before retiring. Annie had never been in her classroom, but nearly everyone in town knew her. She wore her silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and carried a structured leather purse that looked older than Annie. Samuel went to the counter and returned with a framed black and white photograph wrapped in brown paper. Miss Ruth removed her gloves before touching it. The photograph showed a young black soldier in dress uniform standing beside a railroad platform. "You repaired the corner," she said. "Annie did most of it." Miss Ruth turned toward her. "Then thank you, Miss Brooks." "You're welcome, ma'am." The use of her surname made Annie stand straighter. Adults often called her girl when they wanted to remind her of her age. Miss Ruth addressed her as though respect should be offered before it was requested. "My husband sent that picture to me from Georgia in 1966, Miss Ruth said. "He had $17 in his pocket and believed that was enough to build a marriage." "Was it?" Annie asked. "No, but we built one anyway." She placed the photograph carefully inside her shopping bag, then noticed the damaged painting in the back room. "May I look?" Annie nodded. "Please don't touch the surface." Miss Ruth gave her a brief, approving glance. "I would not touch another person's work without permission." She moved closer and studied the image. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then she leaned toward the lower edge. "Samuel, bring that lamp closer." He did. Miss Ruth pointed without touching. "There, near the tear." Annie followed her finger. "The blue mark? It's maybe a bird. It looks like a smudge." It did not always. Miss Ruth removed a pair of reading glasses from her purse. She examined the figure on the train platform, the suitcase, and the child in the farmhouse window. "Where did you find this?" "Beside Route 15, Annie said. "I bought it from a man yesterday." "For how much?" $20. Samuel cleared his throat. "We're trying not to encourage that part." Miss Ruth did not smile. Her attention remained on the canvas. "When I was 9 or 10, my mother took me to an art exhibition in the basement of Mount Olive Church in Baltimore. Most museums would not show black painters then, so churches, schools, and funeral homes gave them wall space. There was a woman named Evelyn Bell." Annie looked at Samuel. Miss Ruth continued. "She painted working people, women waiting for buses, men leaving factories after dark, children watching adults make decisions they could not understand. She placed a small blue bird somewhere in nearly every painting." "You think this is hers?" Annie asked. "I think it deserves a better question than whether it can be sold." Miss Ruth studied the visible signature. "That is not the name I remember." Annie brought over her notebook. "There's a raised line underneath it." Miss Ruth looked at her. "What have you done to the surface?" "Nothing beyond dry dusting on the frame. I tested distilled water on the damaged outer edge, away from the painted area. No solvent yet." "Good." Annie used a soft brush to remove loose dust from the frame, then placed a clean white cloth beneath the lower corner. She explained each step before doing it. Miss Ruth remained nearby as a witness while Samuel recorded the process on Annie's phone. Using a cotton swab barely dampened with a mild conservation solution, Annie tested a spot where the false signature crossed an already damaged section. She rolled the swab once and stopped. A pale trace of newer paint appeared on the cotton. Beneath it was a darker line. Annie changed swabs and repeated the motion across an area no wider than a grain of rice. The upper paint softened. Under it, 2 older letters emerged. A, B. No one spoke. Annie's pulse quickened, but she put the swab down. Samuel looked at her. "You're stopping? I have enough to know there's another layer. Removing more without proper testing could destroy the original." Miss Ruth nodded. "Excitement ruins nearly as many old things as neglect." Annie photographed the exposed initials and wrote down the exact materials she had used. Her hands trembled only after she finished. "A price is what someone offers when they believe they hold the power," Miss Ruth said. "Value is what remains after their power is gone." Annie looked at the 2 buried letters. Why would someone cover her name? To make the painting easier to sell? Or to make another name more important? Miss Ruth closed her purse. Neither answer is innocent. She left with her husband's photograph shortly before noon. Samuel locked the workroom and told Annie no one would enter without her permission. That evening, Miss Ruth climbed the narrow stairs to her attic and opened a cedar chest filled with school programs, exhibition cards, and newspaper clippings she had saved for decades. Near the bottom, beneath a church anniversary booklet, she found a thin catalog dated 1960. The cover read New Voices of Baltimore. Inside was a list of participating artists. One name had been crossed out in black ink so heavily that the paper had nearly torn. Miss Ruth carried the booklet to the lamp and tilted it toward the light. The hidden letters were still visible. Evan Bell. By 8 the next morning, Miss Ruth was standing outside Pike's Frames and Glass with the exhibition booklet tucked inside a plastic grocery bag to protect it from the rain. Samuel unlocked the door and stepped aside. "You're early." "I am prepared," she replied. "That is different." Annie came from the back room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She had slept badly and arrived before sunrise to review the photographs of the buried initials. When Miss Ruth placed the booklet on the work table, Annie forgot the coffee. The cover read New Voices of Baltimore, 1960. Inside, the names had been typed in 2 narrow columns. Near the bottom of the second page, someone had crossed out one entry with thick black ink. Miss Ruth tilted the paper beneath the lamp. The letters remained visible through the mark. Evan Bell. Annie read the name twice. "Why would someone cross it out? Could have been done before the booklet was handed out," Samuel said. "Or afterward," Miss Ruth replied. "The question is who wanted her removed from the record." She turned several pages. A short paragraph described the exhibition as a collection of work by emerging Negro artists from Baltimore and surrounding communities. No individual paintings were listed. "I remember a railroad scene," Miss Ruth said. "Not every detail, but the feeling of it. My mother stood in front of that painting longer than any other. She said the woman looked like somebody deciding whether freedom was worth leaving family behind." Annie glanced toward the wrapped canvas in the locked workroom. Could this be the same painting? It could be. Memory is evidence of a kind, but it is not proof. Miss Ruth removed a peppermint from her purse and placed it beside Annie's notebook. "You need someone who can examine the records and the physical work." Samuel frowned. "Not just anyone. The Hawthorne Museum has a public appraisal day this afternoon," Miss Ruth said. "Their staff should have access to old Baltimore exhibition files." Samuel crossed his arms. "Museums also have donors, lawyers, and locked rooms. They have conservators," Annie said. "They have people who decide what the public gets to know." Miss Ruth looked at him. "Then perhaps Annie should learn what they decide when the painting is placed in front of them." By noon, Annie had wrapped the canvas in acid-free tissue Samuel kept for valuable photographs, then covered it with the moving blanket. Her Cavalier had enough fuel for the framing shop, not Baltimore, so she took a commuter train from Frederick County and transferred toward the city. She carried the painting with both hands through the station. People looked at the awkward bundle, then away. An older man offered his seat without asking what she carried. Annie thanked him, but remained standing so she could keep the frame from striking the floor when the train moved. The Hawthorne Museum of American Art occupied an old stone building with broad steps, carved columns, and banners advertising an exhibition called American Masters, A Century of Vision. Victor Crane's name appeared at the bottom of each banner beneath the words Lead Benefactor. Inside, polished floors reflected chandeliers and expensive shoes. School children gathered beneath a marble staircase while volunteers directed visitors toward the appraisal tables. Annie waited behind a woman carrying silver candlesticks and a man with a Civil War letter sealed in plastic. When her turn came, a staff member examined the size of the wrapped canvas. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Annie glanced at the candlesticks already being appraised at the next table. No one had asked that woman for a receipt. "I bought it yesterday." "From whom?" "A man beside Route 15. The staff member's expression changed. "Do you have a written bill of sale?" "No." Before the woman could answer, another voice came from behind the table. "Let me see it." Lorraine Whitaker wore a Navy suit and a museum badge identifying her as senior registrar. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain. Her manner was controlled, but not welcoming. Annie unwrapped the painting on a padded table. Lorraine's eyes moved over the train platform, the suitcase, and the farmhouse. When she reached the blue mark near the torn corner, her hand stopped above the surface. She did not touch it. For 1 second, all color left her face. Then she straightened. "This is probably a regional copy," she said. "You haven't examined it." "I've seen enough." Annie took out her notebook. "There's another signature beneath the visible one." "I uncovered 2 initials in a damaged section." Lorraine's gaze sharpened. "You cleaned it yourself?" "I documented every step. You should not perform conservation without training." I stopped as soon as I found the older layer. Lorraine lowered her voice. Take it home. Do not clean anything else. Can the museum test it? No. Can you tell me why? It has no institutional significance. Then why do you look frightened? Lorraine's face hardened. You are misreading me. A man standing several feet away turned at the sound of their voices. He wore a charcoal suit and moved with the ease of someone accustomed to entering conversations without invitation. Is there a problem, Lorraine? She answered too quickly. No, Mr. Crane. Victor Crane looked at Annie, then at the painting. His expression remained pleasant until his eyes reached the blue bird. The pause lasted less than a second, but Annie saw it. He smiled. And what have we found today? Nothing confirmed, Lorraine said. Victor stepped closer. May I? Annie did not answer immediately. You can look. Please don't touch it. His smile held, though something behind it cooled. Of course. He examined the canvas and visible signature, then turned to Annie. A charming object, probably a student piece from the mid-century period. Why is there another signature underneath? Old paintings are often reused. Students practiced on discarded canvases. Would that explain why the top signature uses newer paint? Victor looked at her more carefully. You have some training? I work at a framing shop. I see. The two words placed her exactly where he wanted her. Outside expertise, outside authority, outside the rooms where names became facts. He folded his hands. I might offer you $500 for it. Not because it is important, but because the museum occasionally uses damaged examples for educational demonstrations. Annie stared at him. $500 for a student copy? A courtesy. No, thank you. $1,000 then. Lorraine looked at him. Victor kept his attention on Annie. $5,000. Final offer. The appraisal room seemed quieter around them. Annie placed both hands on the frame. You said it has no institutional significance. It doesn't. Then why is it worth $5,000 to you? His smile narrowed. Young people sometimes confuse possession with ownership, Miss Brooks. Miss Brooks. Provenance can become complicated. It would be wise not to make assumptions. It would also be wise not to offer $5,000 for something you just called worthless. Victor's eyes lost their warmth. Do you have a receipt? No. Then I suggest you be careful. Annie began wrapping the painting. Lorraine stood motionless until Victor stepped away to greet a donor. As Annie lifted the canvas, Lorraine moved close enough that no one else could hear. Take it home, she whispered. Forget you brought it here. Annie searched her face. Is that a warning? Lorraine looked toward Victor. It is the only help I can give you. Annie carried the painting out through the marble lobby. A security guard watched her until she reached the doors. On the train back toward Frederick, her phone vibrated. The message came from an unknown number. You possess property that does not belong to you. Annie looked at the wrapped painting resting against her knees. Somewhere inside the museum, Victor Crane already had her name, her face, and a reason to want the canvas returned. For the first time since the roadside purchase, she understood that the hidden signature was not merely a mystery. It was a threat. By the time Annie reached Frederick, the message had disappeared from her screen. She checked the number twice. No name, no profile, no reply option that worked. The train platform had begun to empty, and evening rain tapped against the metal roof. Annie stood beneath the yellow station lights with the wrapped painting against her knees, trying to decide whether fear was a warning or simply another way powerful people made ordinary ones surrender. She took the painting straight to Pike's Frames and Glass instead of returning home. Samuel was locking the front door when she arrived. You're late. I went to the museum. His hand stopped on the key. And they offered me $5,000 for a painting they said was worthless. Samuel opened the door again. Inside, Annie told him everything. Lorraine's reaction, Victor Crane's offers, the questions about ownership, and the anonymous message. Samuel read the words on Annie's phone even though the message itself was gone from the thread. She had taken a screenshot before leaving the train. You possess property that does not belong to you. That sounds like someone trying to frighten you without saying enough to be charged with anything, he said. It worked. Good. Fear is useful when it keeps you from doing something foolish. Annie looked at him. You think I should sell it? I think you should put it somewhere safe and speak to a lawyer. With what money? Samuel rubbed a hand over his jaw. That part needs work. Miss Ruth arrived the next morning carrying the 1,960 exhibition booklet and a paper bag from a bakery. She set both on the front counter. I brought biscuits, she said. People make poor decisions on empty stomachs. Annie showed her the anonymous message. Miss Ruth read it without visible surprise. Then they know the painting matters. That doesn't tell us why. It tells us enough to stop pretending this is only about art. Miss Ruth wanted Annie to continue investigating. Samuel wanted every move documented. Annie wanted the entire matter to disappear. "I'm done," she said. "I'll wrap it, lock it in the back room, and leave it alone." Miss Ruth poured coffee into a paper cup. "You believe silence will protect you? I believe I have rent due." "That is not the same answer." Annie looked toward the workroom. "Victor Crane has lawyers, museum people, and money. I have an old car and 3 jobs. If he says I stole that painting, who do you think people will believe?" Miss Ruth's expression softened, but she did not argue with the truth of it. "Perhaps not you at first," she said. "That is why evidence must speak before reputation does. I can't build a case against a museum. No one asked you to do it alone." Annie almost laughed. "Who exactly is standing in line to help?" The bell above the door rang. A man in a raincoat entered carrying a folded newspaper under one arm. He was in his 40s. With tired eyes and a face Annie recognized from local arts articles Samuel sometimes saved. "Daniel Ruiz," he said. "Miss Carter called me." Annie turned toward Miss Ruth. "You called a reporter?" "A former reporter," Daniel corrected. "At least according to the newspaper that stopped paying me. I didn't give anyone permission to tell my story." "Then I won't write it." His answer came without defensiveness. Miss Ruth introduced them. Daniel ordered coffee from the diner across the road, and half an hour later they sat in a corner booth beneath a framed photograph of downtown Frederick from the 1950s. A waitress refilled Samuel's cup without asking. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes were listed as the lunch special, though it was not yet 10. Daniel placed a small notebook on the table but did not open it. "Miss Carter told me only that you may have found a painting connected to Evelyn Bell. She told you too much." "Maybe. But she was right about one thing. If Victor Crane offered $5,000 after calling it worthless, he recognized something." Annie studied him. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't. Not yet." Samuel gave a faint nod, approving the answer. Daniel continued. "Provenance fraud is difficult to prove. Records are built over decades. A false date gets copied into a catalog. The catalog gets cited by an appraiser. The appraiser's report goes into a museum file. After enough years, the lie looks professional. And if I accuse him, he'll say you altered the painting yourself. He'll ask where you got it, why there's no receipt, and whether an 18-year-old frame shop assistant has the training to challenge museum records." Annie's jaw tightened. "That's exactly what he'll do. Then document everything before he does." Daniel asked to see her photographs, but Annie refused. He accepted the decision and slid a business card across the table. "When you're ready, call me. I can search exhibition archives, tax filings, auction records, and museum donations. I can't promise the truth will protect you. I can promise the lack of it won't." Annie left the card on the table. That afternoon, Clyde Mercer arrived at the framing shop. He entered without greeting, removed his hat, and pointed toward the locked workroom. "I'm here for my painting." Samuel stepped from behind the counter. "You don't own a painting here." Clyde looked at Annie. "That old man had no right to sell it. It belonged to me." "You offered him $5 for something you already owned?" Annie asked. "I was trying to recover it without causing trouble. You called it garbage. I can call my property whatever I want." Samuel moved closer. "You can also leave my shop." Clyde's face reddened. "I'll file a theft report. I'll tell them she knew it was stolen. Then you'd better be prepared to explain why half the roadside saw you trying to buy it." Clyde pointed at Annie. "You think this is a game because some museum man waved money at you? It isn't." He put on his hat and left. That night, Annie returned to the room above the laundromat and found the door partly open. The lock had been forced. Her mattress had been lifted. Drawers stood open. Books and clothes covered the floor. The small television remained in place. So did the cash jar containing $9. Only 3 things were missing. Her first photographs of the painting, the copied appraisal form from the museum, and the page where Miss Ruth had written Evelyn Bell's name. Annie stood in the doorway, unable to breathe normally. Whoever entered had not come to steal. They had come to erase. She sat on the laundromat stairs with a cup of vending machine coffee cooling between her hands. Her first impulse was to call Victor Crane and tell him he could have the painting. Instead, she called Miss Ruth. The older woman answered on the second ring. "Lock your door, child," she said after Annie explained. "Then come stay in my guest room tonight. Courage does not require foolishness." The next morning, a black Lincoln was waiting outside Miss Ruth's house. Elias Vale stood beside it. When Annie stepped onto the porch, he looked at the exhaustion in her face and said, "Victor Crane knows exactly what that painting is." Elias waited until Annie stepped off Miss Ruth's porch before speaking again. "Victor Crane knows what the painting is," he said. "He may not know how much you have discovered, but he knows enough to be afraid." Annie folded her arms. "You could have told me that before someone broke into my room." "I should have. That isn't the same as explaining why you didn't." Miss Ruth opened the screen door behind her. "Mr. Vale, a serious conversation begins with a proper greeting. Come inside." Elias looked at Annie, then removed his hat and followed them into the house. Miss Ruth's living room held shelves of books, framed family photographs, and a piano covered with handwritten cards. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon. She directed Elias toward a chair but remained standing until he did. "Now," she said, taking the seat beside Annie, "you may tell us why a museum chairman is threatening an 18-year-old over a damaged painting." Elias placed both hands on his knees. "My full name is Elias Vale." Annie waited. When he realized she did not recognize it, he continued, "I founded Vale Meridian Holdings. The Vale Heritage Foundation is mine as well." Miss Ruth's expression changed first. "Vale Meridian," Annie repeated. "The shipping company?" "Shipping, commercial property, and several investment firms. And the foundation owns art. It owns too much of it." Annie studied the man sitting across from her. His coat was plain again, though now she understood that plainness had been chosen. The leather shoes, the driver, the black Lincoln, none of it had been accidental. "You're a billionaire." "Yes." Miss Ruth lifted her coffee. "That is a fact, not an explanation." Elias accepted the correction. "The painting came from a storage building used by my foundation. It was part of a collection purchased years ago from several private dealers. One curator raised questions about its history, along with the histories of several other works." "What kind of questions?" Annie asked. "Altered signatures, missing records, paintings attributed to artists whose names did not appear on earlier photographs." Annie's voice hardened. "And what did you do?" "Not enough." The room became still. Elias looked toward the rain moving down the front window. At the time, the foundation was preparing a major exhibition. Donors had committed millions. Museums had borrowed works from us. If we admitted that some pieces might have been falsely attributed, every purchase would have been questioned. "So you buried it," Annie said. "I allowed other people to delay the investigation. That amounted to the same thing. And now you want credit for feeling guilty?" "No." His answer came without defense. Annie looked away. She had expected excuses. Lawyers, bad advice, incomplete information. His refusal to offer them made her angrier. "Then why were you standing beside the road pretending to sell it?" "I was taking the painting to a community archive outside Frederick. I intended to leave it anonymously until the records could be examined. That would have protected your name." "Yes." Miss Ruth set down her cup. "And the car?" "It developed a mechanical problem near the produce stand. My driver left to arrange another vehicle. Clyde Mercer approached while I was waiting." "You let him think you were helpless," Annie said. "For several minutes." "Why?" Elias's face tightened. "I wanted to see how people behaved when they believed I had no power." Annie stood so quickly that the chair legs scraped the floor. "Poor people are not mirrors rich men get to use when they want to study themselves." "I know that now." "You knew it then. You just thought your curiosity mattered more." Elias did not argue. Miss Ruth watched him for a long moment. "Sit down, Annie. Not because he deserves comfort, because you deserve answers." Annie remained standing another second, then returned to her chair. Elias continued. "Victor Crane's father handled paintings by black artists from Baltimore and nearby communities for decades. Some families were paid almost nothing. Other works passed through estate sales after deaths or illnesses. The records were then rewritten." "Rewritten how?" "Names changed, dates changed, ownership chains manufactured. A painting worth a few $100s under one name could be worth millions under another." Annie thought of the pale signature sitting above the buried initials. And Victor continued it. "I believe he did. I cannot yet prove how much." "What do you have?" "Private letters, auction records, old photographs, foundation inventories. Enough to show a pattern, not enough to establish who ordered each alteration." Miss Ruth asked, "What do you need?" "The painting examined properly, its condition documented, the earlier signature confirmed by independent testing, the museum's internal files, and Victor Crane's original transaction ledger." Annie looked at him. "Why me?" Because you found the hidden layer before anyone told you to look for it. Because you documented the painting before Crane could claim you damaged it. And because you own it. I have no bill of sale. You have witnesses. The produce seller saw the exchange. Deputy Briggs saw it. Clyde saw it. Though he will lie. There may also be traffic. Camera footage. Annie frowned. You've already looked. I began after Arthur learned your room had been entered. You had people watching me? Not you. Crane's contacts. That distinction may matter to you. It should matter to me more than it has. Miss Ruth rose and walked to the bookshelf. She removed the exhibition booklet and placed it on the table between them. If Annie helps you, she said, you will not use her to repair your reputation. Elias looked directly at her. Agreed. Annie spoke before he could say more. No, not agreed yet. She counted the conditions on her fingers. You do not buy the painting. You do not speak for me without asking. No threats, no bribing people, and no private deal with Crane. Everything gets copied. Any testing is independent. Daniel receives the records, and so do lawful investigators when there is enough evidence. Elias nodded once. And your foundation's role becomes public, Annie added. Not after Victor falls. At the same time, the silence stretched. That could remove me from the foundation, he said. Then decide whether you want the truth or control of how it looks. Elias lowered his eyes, then reached inside his coat and removed a thin archival folder. You have my agreement. He placed the folder on the coffee table. Inside was an old color photograph of the painting in a better frame. The woman, suitcase, farmhouse, and bluebird were all visible. The pale signature was not. In its place, near the lower corner, was a darker name partly hidden by glare. Annie leaned closer. Elias pointed without touching the image. This photograph was taken in 1972, before the painting entered my foundation's collection. Miss Ruth adjusted her glasses. Annie read the first visible letters. Evel. Her breath caught. The painting had not simply concealed an older mark beneath a newer signature. Someone had removed a woman's name and taught the record to repeat the lie. Elias closed the folder. You asked why Victor Crane is afraid, he said. That is why. Annie looked from the photograph to Miss Ruth, then back to Elias. She still did not trust him, but she now understood that refusing his evidence would not protect Evelyn Bell. It would only leave the truth locked inside another rich man's archive. I'll help, she said, under my rules. Elias gave one measured nod. For the first time since the break-in, Annie did not feel safe. She felt prepared. The next morning, Annie returned to Pike's frames and glass before Samuel unlocked the front door. She carried Elias's archival photograph inside a rigid folder and held it beneath her coat to protect it from the rain. Samuel looked from the folder to her face. You agreed to work with him. Under conditions. Rich men usually hear conditions as suggestions. He heard mine. Samuel unlocked the shop. We'll find out. By 8, Miss Ruth and Daniel had joined them around the back work table. Annie placed the old photograph beside her restoration notebook while Daniel opened his laptop. The image showed the painting in 1972, before the false signature appeared. Its frame was wider and darker, and the bluebird near the lower edge had not yet been covered by grime. Part of the artist's name remained visible despite the glare. Daniel enlarged a digital copy. Evelyn, he said. The surname is harder to read, but the first name is clear. Elias says his foundation has more records, Annie replied. Daniel looked at her. And you believe him? I believe the photograph. Miss Ruth nodded. A useful distinction. They divided the work. Daniel would search auction records, museum donations, tax filings, and exhibition catalogs. Miss Ruth would contact churches, retired teachers, and families who remembered black artists working in Baltimore during the 1950s and 1960s. Elias would release documents from his private archive. Samuel would preserve the shop's camera footage and write a statement establishing when Annie brought the painting inside. Annie would remain responsible for the canvas. No one cleans another inch without independent testing, she said. Samuel lifted his coffee mug. That sounded almost professional. It was professional. Then start charging professional rates. The independent laboratory was located outside Hagerstown in a converted brick schoolhouse. Elias paid the examination fee through his foundation, but Annie insisted that the laboratory contract identify her as the painting's owner and that the results be sent directly to every member of the group. Dr. Helen Ward, a conservator in her 60s, met Annie at the door. She wore no jewelry near her hands and asked permission before unwrapping the painting. I understand you exposed part of the original layer, she said. Less than a quarter inch. I stopped when the initials appeared. That was the correct decision. Relief passed through Annie before she could hide it. Dr. Ward examined Annie's notebook and photographs. You documented more carefully than some collectors with paid staff. I was afraid I'd destroy something. Fear can be useful when it makes your hands slower. The laboratory photographed the canvas under ultraviolet and infrared light. Annie watched from behind a marked line on the floor, while technicians took microscopic samples from existing areas of damage. Dr. Ward explained each process without speaking down to her. The goal is not to prove what we hope, she said. It is to determine what the materials can support. Under ultraviolet light, the upper signature appeared darker than the surrounding paint. Infrared imaging revealed lines beneath it that followed a different hand. The full results would take several days, but the preliminary evidence supported Annie's suspicion. The signature on top had been added later. While the laboratory worked, Miss Ruth traveled through Baltimore with the 1960 exhibition booklet. At Mount Olive Church, an elderly deacon led her into a basement storage room filled with folding chairs, Christmas decorations, and boxes of records no institution had requested. They come asking after somebody becomes valuable, he said, never while they're alive and need paint. Inside one box, they found photographs from church exhibitions. Another contained handwritten programs and receipts for refreshments sold to raise money for artists. Miss Ruth called Annie that evening. I found a woman who remembers Evelyn. Where? An assisted living home in Catonsville. Her name is Lillian Price. She says Evelyn sold paintings to cover her husband's medical bills. Annie looked at the collection notice on her table. How much did dealers pay her? Sometimes $25, sometimes groceries. The numbers felt like an insult repeated across generations. Daniel's search uncovered the other half of the pattern. He found 3 paintings that had first appeared in community exhibitions under the names of black artists, disappeared for years, then returned under different names in private collections. Each work followed a similar route, purchased cheaply through small dealers, transferred through shell companies, appraised at a higher amount, and donated to museums for large tax deductions. Victor Crane's father appeared in 2 transactions. Victor himself appeared in 4 later ones. This wasn't one painting, Daniel said during their next meeting. It was a business model. He turned his laptop toward Annie. A painting of factory workers had been purchased from an estate for $80 in 1978. 12 years later, under another artist's name, it was valued at $900,000. How could a museum accept that? Samuel asked. Daniel leaned back. A donor supplies an ownership history. An appraiser repeats it. The museum wants the gift. Nobody asks questions that might make the donation disappear. Injustice is rarely quiet because it is weak, Miss Ruth said. It becomes quiet after everyone learns the cost of speaking. 2 days later, Dr. Ward called. The group gathered around Samuel's phone in the framing shop. The original paint layer and the buried signature are consistent with materials available in 1959, she explained. The visible signature contains a synthetic pigment introduced commercially years later. It could not have been placed there when the painting was created. Annie gripped the edge of the work table. So someone added it. That is what the materials indicate. We also found traces of blue pigment beneath the dark overpaint near the lower edge. It may match the bird symbol you described. After the call, no one spoke for several seconds. They had moved beyond memory and suspicion. They had proof. That afternoon, Miss Ruth returned from Baltimore carrying a black and white photograph inside a protective sleeve. It showed the basement of Mount Olive Church during the 1960 exhibition. Paintings covered the walls. Women in Sunday dresses stood beside men wearing narrow ties. Near the back was the train platform scene. The handwritten caption beneath it read, "Waiting for the evening train, Evelyn Bell." Annie touched the edge of the sleeve, careful not to cover the words. There she is. Daniel photographed the image and began drafting an article. Before he completed the first page, an email arrived from a law firm representing Victor Crane and the Hawthorne Museum. The subject line read, "Notice of potential defamation and unlawful possession." The letter threatened legal action against Daniel, the framing shop, Miss Ruth, and Annie personally if they published or repeated any claim concerning Evelyn Bell. Samuel read the final paragraph twice. They don't know what we have. Daniel closed his laptop. No. But they know we're close. Annie looked at the old church photograph beside the laboratory report. For 60 years, powerful men had relied on the same defense. The truth was scattered. The witnesses were old, and the families had been taught not to ask. Now the pieces were sitting on one table, Victor Crane's letter was meant to frighten them apart before they could see the whole picture. Annie folded the notice and placed it beside the buried signature. "He wants us to stop speaking," she said. Miss Ruth adjusted her glasses. "Then we should make certain that when we speak, every word can stand on its own." Victor Crane's invitation arrived the next morning on heavy cream paper, delivered by courier to Pike's Frames and Glass. Samuel read the return address and frowned. Men who threaten lawsuits by email and invite you to lunch on paper usually want something they don't want recorded. Annie opened the envelope. Victor requested a private meeting at the Ashford Room, an expensive restaurant near Baltimore's Inner Harbor. The note described the conversation as an opportunity to resolve a misunderstanding before unnecessary harm is done. Daniel advised her not to go alone. Elias offered an attorney. Annie refused both. "If I arrive surrounded by lawyers, he'll speak like a museum chairman," she said. "I need to hear how he talks when he thinks I'm desperate." Miss Ruth studied her over the rim of her glasses. "You are desperate. I know. That is not an insult, child. It is why you should not confuse courage with walking into a trap unprepared." Annie agreed to carry a recorder in her coat pocket and text Daniel before entering and after leaving. Elias arranged for an attorney to wait nearby without appearing at the table. Those were Annie's conditions. The Ashford Room had white tablecloths, dark wood walls, and paintings lit more carefully than most people's homes. A hostess in a black dress looked at Annie's plain navy coat before checking the reservation twice. Victor rose when she approached. He wore a charcoal suit and the same practiced smile he had used at the museum. "Miss Brooks, thank you for coming." Annie sat across from him. "You said you wanted to resolve something." "I do." A waiter poured water and described the lunch specials. Victor ordered grilled salmon without opening the menu. Annie asked for coffee. "You should eat," he said. "I'm not hungry. That often happens when people are under pressure." Annie placed her hands beneath the table so he would not see them tighten. Victor waited until the waiter moved away. "Let us speak plainly. You possess a damaged painting with an uncertain history. You have no formal training, no bill of sale, and no recognized standing in the conservation field. Yet people around you are preparing accusations that could damage respected institutions. The laboratory confirmed the signature was added later. Laboratories confirm materials, not ownership. There's a photograph of the painting under Evelyn Bell's name. Community exhibitions were poorly documented. Captions were often handwritten by volunteers. And the bluebird? A decorative mark. He dismissed each fact before Annie finished speaking, not because he had answers, but because he had spent years learning how to make questions sound childish. Victor folded his napkin beside the untouched bread plate. "I am offering you a way out." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a summary of Annie's medical debt, down to the last fee. Beneath it sat a letter promising full tuition at a Maryland university, campus housing, and a paid position in the Hawthorne Museum's education department after graduation. For several seconds, Annie could not speak. The offer contained everything she had once pictured for herself: classrooms, conservation labs, children gathered around paintings while she taught them how to look closely. It also contained sleep without collection calls and meals chosen for taste rather than price. Victor watched her read. "You are 18 years old," he said. "You have already lost more than most people your age should have to lose. I am not your enemy. What do you want? The painting, your notes, the laboratory report, and a signed confidentiality agreement. You will also state that any alteration you uncovered may have resulted from your own cleaning attempts." Annie looked up. "You want me to say I damaged it? I want you to acknowledge uncertainty. You want Evelyn Bell's name buried again." His expression remained calm. "History is not repaired through emotion. No, it's repaired through evidence. And evidence requires qualified interpretation. You work in a frame shop." The waiter returned with Victor's meal and Annie's coffee. Neither spoke until he left. Victor cut into the salmon. "You could become qualified. That is what I am offering. Education, stability, a profession. And if I refuse?" He took a bite before answering. "Then the debt remains. Your employment difficulties will likely continue. Legal questions about the painting will become more serious. You may spend years defending a claim no institution accepts. You caused those employment difficulties." "I did not say that. You didn't have to." Victor placed his fork down. "Miss Brooks, people like Daniel Ruiz and Elias Vale can afford moral battles. Ruiz has little left to lose. Vale has more money than consequences. You are the one who will pay." The words struck because they were partly true. Annie thought of her room above the laundromat, the eviction notice she expected any day, and Samuel's lost business. She imagined accepting the offer, calling the university, and telling herself Evelyn Bell had been dead for decades and could not feel another betrayal. Then she looked at Victor's hand resting beside the folder. His cuff link carried the Hawthorne Museum seal. "If I sign this," she asked, "will the museum restore Evelyn Bell's name?" Victor's eyes cooled. "There is no reliable basis for doing so. Will her family be told what happened? We do not build scholarship around family stories. Will any of the other paintings be reviewed? That would create unnecessary confusion." Annie closed the folder. "A future bought with someone else's stolen name would not belong to me." Victor leaned back. "Think carefully." "I have. You are making a sentimental decision." "No. I'm making the only decision that lets me become the teacher I said I wanted to be." She stood. Victor did not try to stop her. "Principals are expensive, Miss Brooks." Annie put on her coat. "Then maybe men like you should stop sending the bill to people with less money." By the time she returned to Frederick, the retaliation had begun. The grocery delivery company sent a notice stating that a customer had accused her of mishandling property. Her account was suspended pending review. The cleaning agency removed her weekend shifts because an anonymous caller had questioned her reliability. At Pike's Frames and Glass, Samuel stood behind the counter holding a canceled commercial contract. "Hotel chain says they're moving their framing work elsewhere," he said. No explanation. "I'm sorry. Did you cancel it?" "No." "Then stop apologizing for Victor Crane." Annie's phone rang. The debt company informed her that her account had been transferred for accelerated collection and that new administrative fees had been added. When she asked why, the representative repeated a prepared sentence about changes in risk status. That evening, a local television station aired a short segment about an 18-year-old frame shop employee claiming ownership of a potentially valuable artwork. The screen showed Annie's high school photograph beside Victor's formal museum portrait. He was introduced as a philanthropist and respected authority. She was described as inexperienced. No one mentioned the laboratory report. Samuel turned off the television. "A man who only keeps his principles when business is good does not have principles," he said. "He has advertising." Annie returned home after dark. A white envelope had been taped to her door. The landlord was demanding that she remove disputed property from the building and warning that further complaints could lead to eviction. Annie stood in the narrow hallway with the notice in one hand and Victor's rejected offer still clear in her mind. He had not needed to touch the painting. He was removing everything around her until surrender became the only place left to stand. The eviction warning remained in Annie's hand until the hallway light clicked off above her. For several seconds, she stood in darkness, listening to the laundromat dryers below and the pipes knocking inside the wall. Victor's strategy was simple. He did not need to defeat her argument. He only needed to make the cost of speaking higher than she could bear. Annie unlocked her room and placed the notice beside the debt letters. The college acceptance envelope lay beneath them, its corners bent from months of being moved but never opened. She did not sleep. By morning, the laboratory's final written report arrived. Dr. Helen Ward had signed each page and included high-resolution images of the signature under ultraviolet and infrared light. The conclusion was careful but clear. The visible name had been applied years after the original paint layer had dried. The buried initials and date were consistent with materials available in 1959. Annie read the final paragraph twice. The science could prove that someone changed the painting. It could not yet prove why. At Pike's Frames and Glass, Samuel had already cleared the back table. Miss Ruth arrived with Daniel, followed 10 minutes later by Elias and Arthur. No one mentioned the television segment until Daniel placed his laptop beside the laboratory report. "The station pulled most of its language from Victor's attorney," he said. "I've asked for a correction." "Will they give one?" Annie asked. "Not unless we give them something stronger than a complaint." Elias opened a narrow archival box. "This may help." Inside were several letters protected by clear sleeves. The paper had yellowed at the folds, and the handwriting leaned sharply to the right. The first was signed by Evelyn Bell. Annie read in silence. Evelyn described her husband's illness, the cost of treatment, and a dealer who had offered to purchase 6 paintings for less than the family owed the hospital. She wrote that the man had suggested removing her signature because buyers prefer names they already recognize. Another letter stated that she would sell the canvases if necessary, but not her authorship. The third letter ended in the middle of a sentence. A final page was missing. "Where did these come from?" Annie asked. "They were in a private dealer's correspondence purchased by my foundation," Elias said. "No one cataloged them properly." Daniel pointed to the dealer's name, Charles Crane, Victor's father. Miss Ruth read one passage aloud. He says history is kinder to those who can afford to print it. Samuel looked toward the painting. Family habit, apparently. Annie kept staring at the missing final page. Something about the handwriting felt familiar, though she could not place it. There may be another copy, Elias said. Where? Evelyn sometimes sent duplicate letters to relatives. Annie thought of the boxes that remained after her parents' apartment had been cleared. Samuel had allowed her to store them in the loft above the shop because her rented room was too small. She stood at once. The loft smelled of cardboard, dry wood, and dust. Annie pulled down the first box and found tax forms, utility bills, her father's bus depot badge, and a stack of church programs bound with a rubber band. The second box held her mother's belongings. There were recipe cards, a worn Bible, photographs, and several unfinished paintings on stiff paper. Annie paused over one of blue flowers in a glass jar. Her mother had painted it during the first year of treatment, before weakness made holding a brush difficult. Beneath the paintings lay an old cookbook with flour stains on the cover. A folded sheet of paper slipped out when Annie opened it. The handwriting matched Evelyn's letters. Annie carried it downstairs without speaking. Miss Ruth placed the missing page beside the others. The sentence continued exactly where the archive copy ended. Evelyn wrote that she had refused Charles Crane's demand to surrender the names attached to her work. If anything happened to the paintings, she wanted her sister Clara to remember the blue bird and the train. Annie's eyes moved to the last lines. Tell Clara that the girl in the farmhouse window is her. She believed I was leaving her. I was only trying to find a way to return with enough. Annie looked up. My grandmother's name was Clara. No one answered immediately. She unfolded a photograph from the cookbook. It showed two young black women standing outside a row house in Baltimore. One resembled Annie's grandmother from later family pictures. The other stood beside an easel. On the back, written in faded ink, were the names Clara Brooks and Evelyn Bell, 1958. Anya sat down. The room around her seemed to recede. The painting was no longer only evidence of a forgotten artist or a museum fraud. The woman beside the train had shared family meals, arguments, grief, and blood with the people who raised Annie. Evelyn Bell was her grandmother's older sister. Miss Ruth lowered herself into the chair beside her. Did your mother ever mention her? Only once. Annie's voice sounded distant to her. She said there had been an aunt who painted and disappeared. She called her troubled. Families often inherit the story that caused the least danger, Miss Ruth said. Annie felt anger rise before grief could stop it. My mother knew this letter existed. She may not have understood what it proved. She hid it in a cookbook. She kept it, Miss Ruth replied. That is not the same as throwing it away. Annie looked at her mother's unfinished flowers on the table. For years, she had believed her mother abandoned art because life became difficult. Now she wondered whether the family had learned long before Annie was born that ambition brought punishment, that paintings could be stolen, and that a woman who objected might be remembered as unstable instead of wronged. Daniel enlarged the 1960 church photograph on his screen. The painted child in the farmhouse window had Clara's narrow face and straight posture. The woman by the train is Evelyn, Annie said. Miss Ruth nodded. She was thinking about leaving Maryland, and she stayed, Elias said quietly. To care for family, Annie replied. The same reason my mother stopped painting. The same reason I didn't go to college. No one told her the comparison was sentimental. No one tried to make the discovery beautiful. It was not beautiful. It was a pattern. Annie walked to the painting and studied it. He had known enough to understand the cruelty of the bargain. Until that moment, Annie had been trying to protect one painting. Now she wanted every record, every altered name, every family told that its artist had failed when someone else had profited from the work. She turned to Daniel. How many paintings can we trace? With time, I don't know. Start with every work connected to Charles or Victor Crane. Elias watched her. That will widen the investigation considerably. Good. Samuel folded his arms. You understand what that means? Yes. It means this does not end because Victor leaves me alone. Annie placed Evelyn's final page beside the laboratory report. They didn't just steal her paintings, she said. They taught her own family to forget that she mattered. Daniel opened a new file on his laptop. Elias began listing private inventories. Miss Ruth gathered the photographs into order. As Annie reached for her notebook, an accession log Daniel had printed from an old museum database slid from beneath the letters. One employee had approved nearly every altered record during the past 11 years. Lorraine Whitaker. Annie stared at the name. Victor had not maintained the lie alone. Someone inside the museum had been rewriting history one file at a time. Lorraine Whitaker's name appeared on 12 accession changes, 9 restoration updates, and 4 donor corrections connected to the Crane family. Each alteration had been entered years apart, but the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Daniel enlarged the records on his laptop. She either helped build the lie or helped keep it alive. Annie remembered Lorraine's face at the appraisal table, the color draining from it when she saw the blue bird. She told me to take the painting home and forget I brought it there. That could have been a threat, Samuel said. Or a warning, Miss Ruth replied. Elias stood near the window with one hand in his coat pocket. My people found no sign that Lorraine profited from the altered records. Annie looked at him. Your people? Arthur hired a licensed investigator. Public records only. And what did they find? An old car, a modest apartment, no unusual deposits, no property beyond what her salary could support. Most of her money goes toward legal fees and care for her granddaughter. Daniel leaned back. People do terrible things without getting rich. They do, Elias said. But when a detail does not fit, it usually means we do not understand the pressure being applied. Annie disliked the idea of making excuses for Lorraine. Evelyn's name had been erased one form at a time, and Lorraine's approval sat beneath the changes. Still, greed did not explain why the woman had looked frightened. For the next 3 days, Annie and Daniel watched Lorraine's routine from public places. They did not follow her into private property or approach her family. Daniel insisted on keeping the line clear. If we become reckless, he said, Victor will use our mistakes to bury the evidence. Lorraine left the Hawthorne Museum at nearly the same time each evening. She drove an aging Buick to a grocery store, clipped coupons at the checkout counter, and twice stopped at a small apartment building in West Baltimore. On Sunday morning, she attended church with a girl of about 8 who held her hand while they crossed the parking lot. There was no luxury, no hidden second life. On Monday evening, Annie saw Lorraine remain inside her car after leaving the museum. The parking garage had mostly emptied, and a row of fluorescent lights buzzed above the concrete. Lorraine held a white envelope in both hands. Even from a distance, Annie recognized the heading from years of seeing similar letters. A prison legal services office. Lorraine lowered her face and began to cry. Annie thought of Victor's folder at the restaurant. Debt totals, tuition promises, the price he had assigned to her future. He did not threaten people by raising his voice. He studied what they could not afford to lose. She's being held by something, Annie said. Daniel kept his eyes on the car. That doesn't erase what she did. No, but it tells us where to ask. 2 days later, Annie entered the Hawthorne Museum during public archive hours. Daniel waited in the reading room while Elias's attorney remained outside the building. Annie carried no recording device. She wanted Lorraine to choose the truth, not be tricked into it. The archive occupied a lower floor away from the main galleries. Metal shelves held boxes of donor files, exhibition records, and old catalogs. Lorraine stood at a work table sorting folders into gray storage cartons. When she saw Annie, her shoulders stiffened. You should not be here. It's open to the public. Not every collection is available to you. I'm not here for a collection. Lorraine glanced toward the security camera in the corner. Leave before I call someone. Annie placed a copy of the altered accession log on the table. Your name is on all of them. Lorraine did not look down. You do not understand museum procedure. Then explain it. I have nothing to explain. You saw the blue bird and told me to run. I told you the painting had no significance. No, you said to forget I brought it there. Those aren't the same thing. Lorraine's fingers tightened around the folder she was holding. Annie noticed a small photograph tucked behind her identification badge. It showed Lorraine beside a younger man and the little girl from church. He found the person you could not afford to lose, Annie said. Lorraine went still. For several seconds, the only sound was the ventilation system moving air through the archive. You need to leave, she whispered. Victor did the same thing to me. He found my parents' debt, my jobs, my rent, and my college plans. He offered to give them back if I helped him bury Evelyn Bell. Lorraine's eyes lifted sharply at the name. Annie continued. What did he take from you? The folder slipped from Lorraine's hands. Papers struck the table and spread across the floor. She bent to collect them, but her fingers would not cooperate. My son made a mistake, she said at last. Annie remained silent. Marcus handled accounts for a construction company. His daughter was born with a heart condition. Insurance denied part of the treatment, and he moved money he thought he could replace before anyone noticed. Victor helped him. He arranged an attorney, a good one. He made promises. Lorraine sat down. Then he found additional records the prosecutor had not seen. He told me Marcus could receive years more if those documents appeared. He also knew my granddaughter's father wanted custody. Victor said he could help that man prove I was unfit. So he made you change the museum files. The first time, it was one date, then one ownership name. After that, he knew I had already crossed the line. Her voice thinned. For 11 years, I changed what he told me to change. I kept saying I was protecting my family. Eventually, I stopped knowing whether that was true or simply the sentence I used to sleep. Annie looked at the rows of archive boxes. People were hurt. I know. Families were told their artists failed. Museums profited. Evelyn Bell disappeared. I know. Annie had expected anger to make the moment easier. Instead, she saw a woman who had spent years living inside the consequences of her own fear. Understanding did not become forgiveness. It only made the truth more complicated. You cannot change the first file you altered, Annie said, but you can decide whether the last file carries the truth. Lorraine wiped her face with both hands. If I testify, he will destroy Marcus. If you stay silent, Victor will keep owning him. He will come after my granddaughter. He came after me because he believed I was alone. Lorraine looked toward the camera again. And you are not? Not anymore. The answer surprised Annie with its certainty. Lorraine stood and crossed to a shelf marked Obsolete Tax Records, 2008, 2012. She removed a gray box and placed it on the table. Inside were original accession cards, photographs, shipping receipts, restoration orders, and printed emails. Several images showed signatures before they had been covered. One memo carried Victor Crane's initials beside instructions to regularize attribution prior to donor review. Annie stared at the contents. You kept all this? I made copies every time he ordered a change. Why? Because I hoped one day fear would stop being the only thing I had. Lorraine removed a small digital recorder wrapped in a handkerchief. There are conversations too. Daniel entered after Annie called him from the reading room. He examined the box without touching anything until Lorraine gave permission. This is enough to open an investigation, he said. But Victor will claim his father created the system and that lower employees continued it without his knowledge. Lorraine nodded. There is one thing that ties Victor directly to all of it. What? Annie asked. His father kept a handwritten ledger. Real artists, false names, purchase prices, buyers, donations, tax values. Victor continued adding to it after his father died. Where is it? In the private conservation room behind the Crane Gallery. He keeps it in a wall cabinet. Daniel exhaled slowly. Can you access it? Not without alerting him. Lorraine closed the archive box. If he learns I spoke to you, he will not destroy only me. Annie placed one hand on the lid. Then we make copies before he knows which truth to destroy. By the following afternoon, Lorraine's archive box had been copied 3 times. One set went to Daniel, one to Elias's attorney, and one into secure storage under Annie's name. Lorraine kept the originals inside the museum until they could be transferred without alerting Victor. For the first time, Annie believed they had enough to force an investigation. Victor moved before they could. 2 detectives arrived at Pike's Frames and Glass just after lunch. Samuel was trimming a mat board when the bell above the door rang. Annie looked up and saw the badges before either man introduced himself. Annie Brooks? The older detective asked. Yes, I'm Detective Harris. This is Detective Cole. We need to ask you some questions about a painting connected to the Hawthorne Museum. Samuel set down the cutting knife. Does she need a lawyer? She isn't under arrest. That wasn't my question. Annie's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. I'll call one. Elias's attorney arrived 20 minutes later. Until then, the detectives waited near the front counter and did not ask further questions. Annie appreciated that. They did not treat her kindly, but they did not pretend Victor's accusation had already become fact. At the station, Detective Harris placed several documents on the table. The first was an inventory sheet claiming waiting for the evening train had been stored in a museum-affiliated warehouse until 6 weeks earlier. The second was an insurance photograph showing what appeared to be the same painting. The third was a security log placing Annie near the storage area 2 days before she bought the canvas from Elias. The final page contained Clyde Mercer's sworn statement. He claimed the painting had been offered to him by a nervous young woman before the roadside encounter, and that Annie had worked with Elias to create a false sale. Annie read the statement twice. He's lying. Detective Cole folded his arms. He says you knew the painting was valuable. He called it garbage in front of half the produce stand. Do you have proof? The woman who owned the stand heard him. Deputy Briggs heard him too. Harris looked down at the file. Deputy Briggs says he remembers a disagreement but not the details. Of course he did. Annie's attorney asked. What exactly is my client accused of? Possession of stolen property, possible fraud, and attempted extortion. At this point, we are investigating. Annie looked at the security log again. I've never been inside that storage building. The access record carries your name. I didn't even know it existed. Cole slid the insurance photograph closer. Mr. Crane says you altered the signature after taking the painting. Annie felt the old panic rise, but this time it met something firmer. Check the date. Harris looked at her. The inventory says the painting remained in storage until September 10th. I photographed it at Pike's Frames and Glass on September 3rd. The shop cameras show me carrying it inside that morning. Her attorney opened a folder containing printed timestamps, Samuel's written statement, and the laboratory chain of custody report. The independent lab received the painting before the museum claims it disappeared, he said. And the original photographs contain embedded metadata. Detective Harris examined the documents. Annie continued. There may be traffic, camera footage from Route 15 showing Elias Vale beside the produce stand. The seller gave me the painting in front of witnesses. Cole's expression changed slightly at Elias's name. Elias Vale? Yes. You're saying the billionaire gave you the painting for $20. He sold it to me. That sounds convenient. It sounds strange. Strange and false are not the same thing. By evening, the detectives had released her without charges. They kept copies of the evidence and warned her not to move or alter the painting while the ownership dispute was reviewed. Outside the station, rain had begun falling. Daniel waited beside his car. How bad? He asked. Bad enough. She handed him copies of Victor's documents. He studied the storage record. This access number is wrong. How can you tell? Hawthorne changed its badge format last year. This number uses the new prefix, but the date printed here is 18 months old. Annie looked over his shoulder. Victor's forgery was careful, but not perfect. The mistake would help. It would not stop him from trying again. At Pike's Frames and Glass, Elias was waiting with Samuel and Miss Ruth. Annie placed the forged documents on the back table. They want me to become the thief the story requires, she said. Miss Ruth read Clyde's statement and removed her glasses. Some men mistake repetition for proof. Elias remained silent longer than the others. Daniel noticed. What is it? I need to disclose something before you discover it elsewhere. Annie turned toward him. Elias opened a foundation inventory on his tablet. 3 paintings appeared on the screen. Each had passed through dealers connected to Charles Crane. Each carried an attribution now under question. The Vale Heritage Foundation purchased these works while I was chairman, he said. My curators raised concerns about 2 of them. And you approved the purchases anyway, Annie said. Yes. The room went quiet. How much did you know? Enough to delay, not enough to prove. I told myself there was a difference. There was a difference, Annie replied. You had money, lawyers, and access. Evelyn's family had none. Elias did not look away. You didn't steal the names, she said, but you paid to live comfortably beside the people who did. Yes. Samuel shifted against the workbench. Miss Ruth watched Elias without rescuing him from the silence. Annie had trusted his records because he agreed to expose Victor. Now she understood that Elias was not standing outside the conspiracy. He had benefited from its polished surface. Are there more? She asked. Possibly. Then your archive opens completely. It will. You step down while it is reviewed. Elias's jaw tightened. The foundation board may remove me permanently. Then decide whether you want the truth or the chair. He lowered his eyes toward the paintings on the screen. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the authority it carried in public rooms. Then do not make me innocent. Make me useful. Annie held his gaze. Good. Start by giving Daniel everything. Elias called Arthur and ordered the private archive open to independent reviewers. He authorized the transfer of donor correspondence, acquisition files, and internal warnings. He also agreed to announce his temporary resignation once Daniel's investigation was ready for publication. The decision did not repair what he had done. It made repair possible. Miss Ruth closed the forged museum file and placed it beside Evelyn's letter. Justice does not make the past fair, Annie said. It only stops the lie from collecting more victims. No one answered because the sentence required none. They worked until after dark, comparing Victor's forged records with Annie's original photographs. Samuel left briefly to bring back coffee and sandwiches from the diner. At 9:30, the security alarm sounded from the front of the shop. A second later, glass shattered. Samuel ran toward the showroom, but Annie caught the smell before she saw the flames. Solvent. Fire climbed the curtain beside the framing table and rolled across the wall of wooden molding samples. "Get out!" Samuel shouted. He grabbed the fire extinguisher while Annie reached for Evelyn's letters and the copied records. Smoke filled the ceiling. The heat drove them toward the rear exit. As Annie stumbled into the rain, Samuel remained inside 1 second too long, trying to save a box of customer photographs. He emerged coughing, one sleeve burning near the wrist. Daniel pulled him clear while Elias knocked the flame down with his coat. Sirens approached from the highway. Annie stood in the parking lot, soaked by rain, watching fire move behind the shop windows. Victor's forged papers had failed to make her a thief. Now someone was trying to burn the place where the truth had first been seen. The fire department contained the flames before they reached the locked rear room, but Pike's frames and glass no longer looked like a place where anyone could work. By midnight, the front windows were broken. The ceiling above the showroom had collapsed in one corner, and black water ran across the floor beneath ruined molding samples. The fire marshal moved through the wreckage with a flashlight while a paramedic wrapped Samuel's burned wrist and checked his breathing. "You should go to the hospital," Annie said. Samuel sat on the rear bumper of an ambulance, an oxygen tube beneath his nose. "I have smoke in my lungs, not a death wish." "That isn't an answer." "It is the answer you're getting." The paramedic gave Annie a tired look. "He's stable, but he needs observation." Samuel started to object, then coughed hard enough to bend forward. Annie folded her arms. "You're going." He looked at her over the oxygen tube. "You get bossy when buildings catch fire. I learned from you." Daniel rode with Samuel to the hospital. Elias remained with the investigators, while Annie stood beneath the awning of the closed hardware store next door. Rainwater dripping from her sleeves. The painting was safe in the attorney's secure storage. Evelyn's original letters were safe as well. Annie had carried only copies that evening, and those were now wet but readable, inside a plastic evidence bag. She knew they had been fortunate. The knowledge did not help. By sunrise, word had moved through Thurmont. The first person to arrive was the owner of the diner across the road carrying a cardboard tray of coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Then came a retired electrician with an extension cord, 2 church volunteers with cleaning supplies, and an older veteran named Mr. Dorsey who unloaded sheets of plywood from his pickup without asking who would pay him. "Front window first," he said. "Rain's coming again tonight." Annie tried to thank him. He waved her off. "Samuel framed my wife's photograph after she died. Wouldn't take a dime until the funeral was over. This is not charity." By 9, half the parking lot was filled with people. Some had known Samuel for years. Others had heard that a young woman working in his shop was being threatened over an old painting. They brought shop vacuums, work gloves, tarps, folding tables, casseroles, and advice. Miss Ruth arrived with pound cake wrapped in wax paper and immediately began assigning tasks. "Coffee goes on the dry table," she told a volunteer. "Documents stay away from food, and no one touches anything the fire marshal has marked." No one questioned her. Annie moved through the damaged shop collecting what could be saved. She found scorched photographs, warped frames, and a child's watercolor protected beneath broken glass. Every ruined object belonged to someone who had trusted Samuel with a memory. The guilt settled deeper with each item. When Samuel returned that afternoon with his arm bandaged and strict instructions to rest, Annie met him beside the boarded window. "I'm stopping," she said. Samuel's face remained unreadable. "Stopping what?" "The investigation." Miss Ruth looked up from a box of records. Daniel closed his laptop. Annie continued before anyone could interrupt. "Victor came after my work, my housing, and my name. Now your shop is burned and you were hurt. I don't have the right to keep asking other people to pay for my decision." Samuel glanced at the volunteers moving through the showroom. "Did you set the fire?" "No." "Did Miss Ruth?" "Of course not." "Then you're apologizing for the wrong man again. That doesn't change what happened." "No, it changes who carries the blame." Annie looked at his bandaged wrist. "You could have died. And surrendering guarantees no one else gets hurt?" She had no answer. Elias stood near the rear door. "If you want to stop, the choice is yours. I will not pressure you." Annie turned toward him, surprised. He held out a waterproof case containing the remaining foundation files. "These belong with you whether you continue or not. Copies have gone to Daniel and the attorney. Victor cannot erase them now. You think I should quit? I think no one has the right to demand courage from someone else." The words were gentler than Annie wanted them to be. Anger would have made refusal easier. That evening, after the volunteers left, Annie remained alone in the damaged workroom. Rain struck the plywood covering the front windows. The smell of smoke had entered the walls. Her mother's old tool roll sat on the table beside Evelyn's letters. Annie opened the final page again. Near the bottom, beneath the passage about Clara and the farmhouse window, Evelyn had written another sentence in smaller handwriting. They believe a woman alone will eventually become too tired to defend her own name. Annie read it twice. Victor's methods had changed with time, but his expectation had not. He attacked income, housing, reputation, and anyone willing to help until exhaustion could be mistaken for consent. He did not need people to believe his lie forever. He needed the truth-teller to become too tired to repeat herself. Annie looked through the broken doorway toward Samuel, who was sleeping upright in his office chair because lying down made him cough. Miss Ruth had left food in the refrigerator. Mr. Dorsey had boarded the windows. Daniel had copied every file. Lorraine had preserved evidence for 11 years. Elias had agreed to expose his own failures. Annie was not alone. The realization did not remove the danger. It changed what the danger meant. She opened Daniel's notes about Victor. He likes private rooms, she said when the others gathered the next morning. He likes people to know he has the only copy, the only record, the only authority. Daniel nodded. Control is part of the performance. The ledger is the one thing he believes no one else can reach. Lorraine, joining by encrypted call, lowered her voice. He keeps it in the conservation room behind the crane gallery. Only 3 badges open that door. Can yours? Yes, but every entry is logged. Annie looked at the announcement displayed on Daniel's screen. The Hawthorne Museum Founders Gala would take place in 6 days. Victor planned to unveil the new Crane family gallery before donors, politicians, and reporters. He won't bring the ledger out for us, Elias said. He will if he thinks he's proving that I have no power. Samuel shifted in his chair. What are you proposing? I tell him I'm ready to sign. Miss Ruth's expression tightened. Annie. I bring him the painting, the restoration notes, and Evelyn's letters. At least, that's what he thinks. Daniel understood first. A replica. We use the high-resolution images. Samuel can match the frame. With one hand? Samuel asked. With supervision. He almost smiled. Annie continued. Lorraine wears a recorder. Daniel releases the investigation through several outlets at the same time. Elias provides the foundation records publicly. The attorney files for an emergency preservation order before the gala begins. And investigators, Miss Ruth asked. They receive sealed copies in advance. If Victor destroys anything, he proves obstruction. If he opens the ledger and explains it, we have him. Elias studied her. He may become violent. That is why the original painting stays with the attorney. Every record is backed up. I'm not going there to steal anything. You are going there to provoke him. I'm going there to let his pride do what our questions cannot. For the next 5 days, the damaged shop became a command center. Samuel built a replica frame. Daniel coordinated publication. Elias's attorneys prepared filings. Lorraine copied final access records and tested the recorder hidden behind her museum badge. On the morning of the gala, Annie, dressed in the dark dress Miss Ruth had lent her, and placed her mother's tool roll beneath her coat. At noon, Lorraine failed to answer the first scheduled call. At 1, she missed the second. Then Annie's phone vibrated. A photograph showed Lorraine seated inside the museum's private conservation room. Her face was pale. Victor stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of the chair. The message beneath it contained 6 words. Bring the painting. Come alone. The message remained on Annie's screen as the museum's limestone facade rose beyond the rain-streaked windshield. Bring the painting. Come alone. She read it once more, then locked the phone. The replica rested across the back seat beneath a gray protective cover. The original remained in secure storage with Elias's attorney. Daniel had copies of every report. Investigators already possessed sealed evidence. If Victor destroyed the ledger, the investigation would continue. But Lorraine was still inside. Annie stepped from the car and crossed toward the service entrance of the Hawthorne Museum. A string quartet played somewhere above her, the music filtering through stone corridors as staff hurried between kitchens, elevators, and the gala hall. Through an open doorway, she saw donors in evening gowns and dark suits gathering beneath a banner that read, 100 Years of American Vision. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays. Victor Crane's name appeared beneath the title of the new gallery. Annie wore the dark dress Miss Ruth had lent her. Her mother's worn tool roll rested beneath her coat. Pressing against her side, a security guard waited near the service elevator. "Miss Brooks?" "Yes." He looked at the covered painting. "Mr. Crane is expecting you." The elevator carried her to the conservation level. When the doors opened, Victor stood at the end of the corridor. He smiled as though welcoming a guest. "You made the sensible choice. Where is Lorraine?" "Safe." "That wasn't my question." Victor's smile narrowed. "Bring the painting." He led Annie into the private conservation room behind the Crane Gallery. Lorraine sat beside a metal work table. Her museum badge remained clipped to her jacket, but her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Annie searched her face. Lorraine gave the smallest nod. She was frightened, but not injured. Victor closed the door. "Put it there." Annie laid the covered replica on the padded table. Victor did not. Inside was a prepared confession. It stated that Annie had purchased an ordinary damaged painting, altered the signature during an amateur cleaning attempt, then invented the Evelyn Bell story to demand money from the museum. Victor placed a pen on the page. "Sign it, and this ends tonight." "What happens to Lorraine?" "She keeps her position." Lorraine looked down. "And my debt?" Annie asked. "Resolved. College? Paid in full. Housing included. The museum education position remains available." Annie let silence stretch between them. Victor mistook it for surrender. "You can still have the life you wanted," he said. "You are young enough to survive one mistake." "One mistake?" "Listening to people who used your grief for their own purposes." "You mean Miss Ruth? Daniel? Elias?" "I mean people who can leave when this becomes inconvenient. You are the one who will remain poor when they lose interest." The words had worked on Annie once. Tonight, they sounded rehearsed. She rested one hand on the confession. "If I sign this, you'll say the visible signature is genuine. It is the accepted attribution." "Accepted by whom?" "The museum, appraisers, collectors, courts if necessary." "What proves it?" Victor glanced at the covered painting. "The ownership record." "The records Lorraine changed?" His face hardened. Lorraine's fingers moved once against her badge. "The recorder was running." Annie continued. "You said I'm inexperienced. Show me the record I failed to understand." "You are not in a position to demand anything." "Then I can't sign. If I'm admitting I lied, I need to know what truth I'm admitting against." Victor studied her. Pride and suspicion struggled behind his expression. Annie lowered her voice. "Or maybe there is no original record. Maybe your father created the story and you spent years repeating it." That reached him. "My father documented every transaction." "Then prove it." Victor crossed to a wood-paneled wall beside the storage cabinets. He pressed a hidden latch, opened a narrow compartment, and removed a black leather ledger. Lorraine's breathing changed. Victor placed the book on the table but kept one hand over it. "This contains purchases, transfers, restorations, appraisals, and donations going back more than 50 years. Annie looked at the worn cover. "Including Evelyn Bell?" Victor opened the ledger and turned several pages. A column listed real artist names. Beside them were altered attributions, purchase prices, later valuations, and institutional destinations. Evelyn Bell appeared halfway down one page. Original purchase, $35. Reattributed value, $12 million. Annie felt anger move through her, but she kept her face still. "Your father did this?" He understood the market. He erased her name. He corrected an obstacle. She refused to surrender authorship. Victor gave a tired sigh. "Miss Brooks, artists often misunderstand what gives work value. Talent matters less than confidence, placement, reputation, and demand." "And after your father died?" "I maintained what he built." The answer came easily. "Too easily?" Annie asked. "You ordered Lorraine to alter the museum files?" Victor looked toward her. Lorraine lowered her head. She performed her duties. Did she choose to? She understood the consequences of disappointing people who had protected her family. Lorraine's jaw tightened. Annie looked at the ledger. "So Evelyn's family received almost nothing. Your father changed the name, and you used the museum to make the lie official." Victor's patience broke. Truth has never belonged to the person who suffered. It belongs to the person who controls the record. Annie met his eyes. "Then you should have been more careful about who learned to read it." She pulled the cover from the painting. Victor stared at the replica. The copied surface was convincing at a distance, but the fresh backing and recreated frame revealed the deception. His face changed. "Where is the original?" "Somewhere you can't reach." He seized the confession and tore it in half. You foolish girl. Annie heard the gala music stop beyond the walls. A second later, every monitor in the conservation room went black. Then Evelyn Bell's church exhibition photograph appeared on the screen. Waiting for the evening train, Evelyn Bell. Victor turned toward the monitor as Daniel's recorded voice began describing the altered signatures, false succession histories, tax valuations, and Crane family transactions. The broadcast was running throughout the museum. Victor reached for his phone. No signal. Elias's attorneys had activated the preservation order and restricted internal systems from remote alteration. Victor grabbed the ledger. You think a slideshow changes anything? The conservation room doors opened. Elias stepped into the main gallery above, visible through the interior glass wall. Donors and reporters turned toward him as he took the microphone. My foundation purchased works we had reason to believe were falsely attributed, he said. I ignored warnings because the truth threatened my reputation. Annie Brooks did what I failed to do. She looked beneath the name she was given. Victor moved toward the private exit. Lorraine stood. You're not leaving with that book. He turned on her. Sit down. For 11 years, the command had been enough. Not tonight. Lorraine removed a second ledger from beneath a document cloth on the side table. Victor stared at it. She had replaced the original before the gala. The e-book in his hands was a marked copy. Lorraine stepped into the gallery and raised the real ledger where the guests could see it. For 11 years, I changed names because I was afraid, she said, her voice shaking but audible. Tonight, I am putting one name back. Victor lunged toward her. Annie moved between them. He shoved her aside. But before he could reach Lorraine, museum workers entered from both corridors. Cleaners, guards, preparators, registrars, and technicians formed a line across the gallery. Victor looked at security. Remove them. No one moved. He turned toward the private corridor, but the doors had locked under the court order. State investigators entered from the public gallery. Victor stopped beneath the new Crane family gallery sign as they approached. Behind him, the largest screen in the museum displayed Evelyn Bell's original signature. For the first time in decades, his name was smaller than hers. By midnight, the Hawthorne Museum no longer belonged to Victor Crane. Investigators sealed the private conservation room, photographed the ledger, and collected every device from Victor's office. Lorraine surrendered her badge and gave a recorded statement before leaving with an attorney. Elias remained in the main gallery long after the donors had gone, answering questions he had avoided for years. Annie sat on a bench beneath Evelyn Bell's enlarged signature with an ice pack against her shoulder. The shove had bruised her, but nothing was broken. Daniel lowered himself beside her. The story is everywhere. How bad? For Victor? For all of us. Daniel looked toward the investigators moving through the gallery. Bad enough to be honest. That was the only answer Annie trusted. The following months did not unfold like the ending of a movie. Victor was not sentenced the next morning. The museum did not repair decades of wrongdoing with one apology. Lawyers argued over ownership, tax records, altered files, and which officials had known enough to ask questions but had chosen not to. The evidence, however, held. The independent laboratory confirmed Evelyn Bell's authorship. Annie's photographs proved the condition of the painting before anyone at Hawthorne could claim she had altered it. Lorraine's recordings captured Victor describing the scheme in his own words. The ledger connected black artists' original names to false attributions, private sales, museum donations, and inflated appraisals. The charges against Annie disappeared. The eviction warning was withdrawn after the landlord received a letter from her attorney and several calls from reporters. The grocery delivery company offered to restore her account. Annie declined. The cleaning agency apologized in a message that sounded as though no person had actually written it. Samuel framed the apology and hung it in the shop's restroom. Pike's frames and glass reopened 6 weeks after the fire. The front window had been replaced, the smoke-damaged walls repainted, and a group of local carpenters rebuilt the work tables. Samuel insisted on paying them. They refused until Miss Ruth ordered everyone to accept enough money for lunch. You cannot build a community, she told them, if everyone is too proud to let someone else contribute. Samuel's wrist healed, though he claimed it ached whenever customers asked for impossible deadlines. Lorraine entered a cooperation agreement with prosecutors. She admitted altering records and did not ask anyone to call her innocent. Her preserved files and testimony were considered, as were Victor's threats against her son and granddaughter. Some of the affected families forgave her. Others did not. Lorraine accepted both. She later joined an independent project creating a digital archive where original accession cards, photographs, restoration reports, and attribution changes could be viewed together. No single registrar or donor would be able to quietly rewrite a name again. Elias stepped down from the Vale Heritage Foundation while its collection underwent review. 3 disputed paintings were returned to artist descendants. Other works remained under investigation. At his first public hearing, a reporter asked whether helping Annie had redeemed him. No, Elias answered. Doing the right thing late does not make the delay harmless. Annie heard the response on the radio while sanding an old frame in Samuel's shop. She did not forgive Elias all at once. He never asked her to. Her parents' medical debt was reviewed by legal aid attorneys. Several charges had been transferred improperly, and much of the accumulated interest came from agreements Annie had signed while grieving and without adequate explanation. The balance was reduced through legal relief and restitution connected to Victor's attempt to use the debt against her. Elias offered to pay the remainder. Annie refused. Instead, she accepted a scholarship administered by an independent educational trust, with no requirement that she praise the Vale name. She enrolled in a Maryland program combining art education, conservation science, and African American cultural history. On her first day of classes, she carried her mother's tool roll inside her backpack. 1 year after the gala, the Hawthorne Museum opened a new exhibition. The Crane family gallery was gone. In its place stood a title printed in plain black letters, Evelyn Bell, the name beneath the paint. The museum displayed the restored painting alongside Evelyn's letters, the Mount Olive Church photograph, scientific images of the buried signature, and copies of the altered records. A separate wall explained the museum's own role in accepting convenient stories from wealthy donors. Nothing was hidden behind passive language. Annie arrived with 12 children from the weekend art program she had started with Miss Ruth and Samuel. The students learned drawing, basic conservation, archival research, and the histories of artists left out of textbooks. Miss Ruth wore a navy dress and pearl earrings. Daniel stood near the press area. Lorraine remained at the edge of the room, uncertain whether she had the right to move closer. Samuel brought her a folding chair. "You're part of the record now," he said. "Might as well sit where you can see it." Elias arrived without staff or photographers. He stood behind the students and waited until Annie acknowledged him with a nod. The painting hung beneath soft museum light. The smoke residue was gone. The storm clouds held blue and violet beneath the gray. The child in the farmhouse window was clearer now, one hand resting against the glass. Near the lower edge, the blue bird had returned, and where the false name had once been, the original signature remained visible. Evain Bell, Ezerkilens Azutvenkilens. A young black girl named Tasha stood beside Annie and studied the canvas. Why did they cover her name? Because they believed taking her name would make the painting easier to own. Tasha frowned, but it was still hers. Yes. Then who gave it back? Annie looked around the gallery. Miss Ruth had preserved the memory. Samuel had protected the work. Daniel had followed the paper trail. Lorraine had saved the records. Elias had opened the archive and accepted what it revealed. Museum workers had stood between Victor and the door. Then Annie looked at her own reflection in the protective glass. She left enough truth behind for us to find it. Beside the painting, a small plaque read, "Waiting for the evening train. Evain Bell, Ezerkilens Azutvenkilens." Her work was stolen. Her name was hidden. Her story endured. After the visitors moved toward the next room, Elias approached Annie. "I brought something." He handed her a photograph of the $20 bill inside a simple wooden frame. "You kept it?" "It hangs in my study. There's no label. There shouldn't be." "Why not?" "Because the lesson was never mine to sign." Annie returned the photograph. Inside her coat pocket rested the university acceptance letter she had once left buried beneath collection notices. She had kept the old one even after receiving a new admission package. Through the museum glass, her reflection stood beside Evelyn's restored name. For years, women like them had been kept outside history, allowed to look in only after someone else decided their lives had value. Annie now understood that the $20 had never purchased a masterpiece. It had purchased a torn canvas from a stranger beside a highway. Everything that followed began before she knew the painting's price, Elias's fortune, or the danger beneath the varnish. She had chosen dignity first. Because she did, a stolen name returned to history. This story reminds us that truth may be hidden, delayed, or buried beneath the power of those who control the record, but it does not disappear. Real courage is choosing dignity before knowing whether justice will come, and real accountability means telling the truth even when it damages our own reputation. Annie's journey shows that one person can challenge injustice, but lasting change happens when witnesses, families, workers, and institutions stand together to restore the names and stories that were stolen. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.